Isaiah Carter sat shackled in a sweltering Alabama courtroom, sweat beading down his neck, as Judge Harold Whitaker smirked, delivering a reluctant acquittal on a petty vandalism charge. The old judge, notorious for his bias, leaned forward, his voice dripping with venom, muttering that Isaiah's kind always ended up back in trouble. The gallery snickered, assuming he was done for, but Isaiah's eyes burned with defiance, silently vowing to dismantle this corrupt empire. What would it cost him to fight a system hell-bent on his destruction? Before diving into this tale, let everyone know where they're watching from, and if they stand for justice against all odds, hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode is packed with twists nobody should miss. Isaiah Carter stepped out of the courthouse into the sticky Alabama heat, his wrists still raw from the shackles, the echo of Judge Harold Whitaker's sneer burning in his ears. He was free, technically, but the weight of the judge's words clung to him like damp cotton, heavy and suffocating. The small town of Crestwood buzzed around him, folks going about their day, casting sidelong glances at the lanky 17-year-old black kid in a faded denim jacket. He kept his head down, hands shoved deep into his pockets, aiming for the trailer park where his mama, Ruby, would be waiting with a plate of cornbread and greens to celebrate his release. 3 days had passed since the courtroom drama, and, for a moment, Isaiah let himself believe the worst was behind him. He was wrong. Dead wrong. As he turned down Sycamore Lane, a dusty stretch of gravel lined with crumbling shotgun houses, a sheriff's cruiser screeched to a halt in front of him, kicking up clouds of red dirt that stung his eyes. Sheriff Lyle Tatum, a hulking white man with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl, stepped out, his boots crunching ominously as he adjusted the belt around his thick waist. Tatum was Judge Whitaker's right-hand enforcer, known for making life hell for Crestwood's black residents, and Isaiah had seen him in the courtroom gallery, smirking alongside the judge. Before Isaiah could react, 2 deputies flanked him, their hands hovering over holsters while a small crowd of onlookers gathered, drawn by the flashing lights like moths to a porch lamp. Isaiah's stomach twisted. He knew this wasn't a friendly stop. Tatum sauntered closer, his pale blue eyes glinting with something cruel, and barked for Isaiah to empty his pockets. Isaiah hesitated, his mouth dry as sandpaper, but he complied, pulling out a bent bus pass, a stick of gum, and 37 cents in change. The crowd murmured, some whispering slurs under their breath, their voices a low hum of disdain. Tatum wasn't satisfied. He snatched Isaiah's backpack, a tattered hand-me-down from his cousin, and dumped its contents onto the gravel. Textbooks, a half-eaten apple, and a spiral notebook scattered at his feet. Then, with a theatrical flourish, Tatum reached into the bag's front pocket and produced a small plastic baggie filled with white powder, holding it up like a trophy. Isaiah's heart stopped. He'd never seen drugs in his life, let alone touched them. He shouted that it wasn't his voice, cracking with desperation, but Tatum's grin only widened as he waved the baggie for the crowd to see. The murmurs turned to gasps, then jeers as folks started filming on their phones, their faces twisted with disgust. Isaiah's mind raced. He knew this was a setup, a blatant frame job. But how could he prove it? Thinking fast, he pointed to the cruiser's dashcam, demanding they check the footage right there and then, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. If this was recorded, it would show Tatum planting the drugs plain as day. The crowd shifted, some muttering about fairness, but Tatum's expression didn't falter. He nodded to one of his deputies, who climbed into the cruiser and fiddled with the equipment for a tense minute. Isaiah held his breath, praying for a miracle, but the deputy emerged shaking his head, claiming the camera had malfunctioned just before the stop. The footage was gone, conveniently vanished, and Isaiah's hope crumbled like dry cornbread. Before he could protest further, Tatum slammed him against the cruiser, cuffing his wrists so tight the metal bit into his skin, and read him his rights in a mocking drawl. Possession with intent to distribute, he said, a felony charge that could lock Isaiah away for years. The crowd's jeers grew louder, a chorus of hate as someone spat on the ground near Isaiah's sneakers, calling him a thug who deserved worse. They shoved him into the back of the cruiser, the door slamming with a finality that echoed in his bones. And as the car pulled away, Isaiah caught a glimpse of a young girl filming, her face pale with shock, before she turned and ran. He didn't know her, but he hoped she'd spread the truth because right now it felt like the whole town was against him. The ride to the station was a blur of flashing lights and Tatum's smug chuckles, but Isaiah's mind was already working, piecing together how to fight this. He knew the drugs weren't his. He knew Tatum had planted them. He just needed proof, or at least a way to expose the lie. At the station, they booked him, took his fingerprints, and tossed him into a holding cell that stank of piss and despair. The concrete walls were scratched with names and curses, a testament to all the souls who'd been chewed up by Crestwood's so-called justice system. Hours later, Ruby arrived, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling as she pressed them against the glass separating them. She begged the deputies for mercy, her voice cracking as she explained Isaiah was a good kid, a straight-A student with dreams of college, not some dealer. The deputies just shrugged, one muttering under his breath that she should have raised him better. Ruby's pleas fell on deaf ears, and when they finally let her speak to Isaiah through the glass, she whispered that she believed him, that they'd get through this together. But as she left, clutching her worn purse, Isaiah felt a pang of guilt. He hated seeing her hurt like this, hated how this town kept breaking her spirit. The next morning the nightmare got worse. Isaiah woke to the sound of his cellmate reading the local paper, a cheap rag called the Crestwood Chronicle, and there on the front page was a grainy photo of him in cuffs, his face twisted in anger. As Tatum held up the baggie, the headline screamed, "Local thug busted in drug sting," and the article painted him as a menace, claiming unnamed sources confirmed he'd been dealing for months. It didn't mention the missing dashcam footage, didn't mention his protests of innocence, just spun a story so vicious it turned Isaiah's stomach. By noon, word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors who'd once nodded politely at Ruby now crossed the street to avoid her, whispering behind their hands. Old Mrs. Jenkins, who used to slip Isaiah extra cookies at church, called Ruby to say she couldn't have a criminal around her grandkids anymore. Even the pastor at their Baptist church suggested Ruby pray harder for her son's soul, as if Isaiah's arrest was her failure, not the system's. Ruby held her head high, but Isaiah knew it cut deep. She'd spent years scrubbing floors at the county hospital to give him a shot at something better, and now the town was tearing that dream apart. Back in his cell, Isaiah sat on the hard cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, his mind racing despite the weight of it all. He couldn't let this lie stand. He wouldn't. He'd heard stories of kids like him getting railroaded into pleas, locked up for years on charges that never stuck, and he refused to be another statistic. The drugs weren't his, the footage was tampered with, and he'd prove it even if it meant taking on Tatum, Whitaker, and the whole damn town. He didn't have a lawyer, didn't have money, but he had his brain, his mama's faith, and a fire in his gut that wouldn't quit. As the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, Isaiah clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, and made a silent promise. He'd fight this, not just for himself, but for every kid Crestwood had chewed up and spat out. He just didn't know, yet how steep the cost would be, how the town's hatred would dig deeper, claw harder, until it threatened to bury him alive. Isaiah Carter sat on the lumpy cot in Crestwood's juvie detention center, the air thick with the stench of bleach and despair, his fingers stained with ink from the law books he'd begged off the overworked librarian. It had been 6 nights since Sheriff Lyle Tatum framed him with planted drugs, 6 nights since the town turned on him and his mama Ruby, their whispers like knives in the dark. The concrete walls around him were scratched with the names of kids who'd given up, but Isaiah wasn't one of them. He'd spent every waking hour poring over legal texts, squinting under the dim flicker of a single bulb, his eyes burning, but his mind sharp as a tack. He found what he needed buried in a dusty tome on Fourth Amendment rights, a precedent from 1982 that voided searches without probable cause if the officer's account didn't hold water. Tatum had no reason to stop him that day on Sycamore Lane, no real evidence beyond his own word, and Isaiah knew that word was worth less than the gravel under his boots. With no money for a lawyer and no trust in the public defender who'd Barely glanced at his file, Isaiah decided to represent himself. It was a long shot, but he'd rather bet on his own brain than some suit who'd already written him off as guilty. The morning of the pre-trial hearing arrived, a muggy Thursday. It had felt more like a pressure cooker than a courtroom. Isaiah stood in his ill-fitting county-issued jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, as Judge Harold Whitaker glared down from the bench, his jowls quivering with disdain. The same judge who'd mocked him after the vandalism acquittal now looked ready to bury him for good. The gallery was packed, folks whispering behind their hands, their eyes boring into Isaiah like he was a sideshow act. The prosecutor, a slick white man named Vernon Hayes with a tie that cost more than Ruby's monthly rent, smirked as he shuffled his papers, confident this would be a slam dunk. Hayes opened with a flourish, claiming Isaiah's possession charge was airtight, that the drugs in his backpack were proof of intent to distribute, and that the town needed protection from troublemakers like him. The word landed like a slap, and Isaiah caught the jury's glances, a mix of bored middle-aged folks and one older black woman whose lips tightened at the slur. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and when it was his turn to speak, he stood tall, his voice clear despite the tremor in his knees. He argued that Tatum's stop lacked probable cause, citing the 1982 case with precision, pointing out the missing dashcam footage as proof of tampering, and questioning why a routine patrol turned into a setup so fast. The courtroom fell silent, even Whitaker's pen pausing mid-scroll as Isaiah laid out his case step by step, like he'd been born for this. Hayes stammered, caught off guard, his face reddening as he tried to counter, but Isaiah's logic was ironclad. The jury shifted in their seats, whispers rippling through the gallery, and for the first time, Isaiah felt a spark of hope. After a tense recess, Whitaker returned, his face a storm cloud, and begrudgingly ruled in Isaiah's favor, dismissing the possession charge for lack of admissible evidence. The gavel cracked like thunder, and the room erupted in murmurs, some folks shaking their heads in disbelief, others glaring at Isaiah like he'd cheated death itself. As the cuffs came off, Isaiah exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief, thinking maybe, just maybe, he'd turned a corner. He caught the eye of the older black juror, who gave him a small nod, a flicker of pride in her gaze, and for a moment he believed he'd won something bigger than just his freedom. But Crestwood wasn't about to let him off that easy. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky a bruised purple, Isaiah walked the 3 miles back to the trailer park, his sneakers kicking up dust along the cracked asphalt. Ruby waited on the sagging porch, her arms crossed, tight across her chest, a weary smile breaking through her worry when she saw him. She pulled him into a hug, her grip fierce, whispering thanks to God for bringing him home. They sat down to a simple supper of beans and rice, the radio humming gospel tunes in the background, and for a few hours the world felt almost right. Then came the crash of glass, sharp and sudden, shattering the fragile piece like a gunshot, in the night. Isaiah jumped to his feet, heart pounding, as Ruby screamed, clutching the edge of the table. Another window exploded inward, shards glittering on the linoleum, and the stench of spray paint hit them like a wave. Isaiah yanked Ruby down behind the couch just as a brick sailed through the third window, narrowly missing her head. Voices outside roared with laughter, slurs cutting through the dusk like knives. Vile words Isaiah had heard too many times before, but never like this, never so raw and close. He peeked through a jagged hole in the glass, his breath hitching, as he saw a dozen figures in the shadows, their faces masked by darkness but their intent clear as day. Leading them was a man he recognized even from 50 yards away. Tatum's cousin, Billy Ray, a wiry redneck with a Confederate tattoo snaking up his neck, known for stirring up trouble at every black-owned spot in town. Billy Ray held a can of spray paint, shaking it with a grin as he scrawled, "Go back to where you came from," in dripping red letters across the trailer's siding. The mob whooped, tossing beer bottles that shattered against the steps, their taunts growing louder, uglier until they faded into the night, leaving behind a wreckage of glass and hate. Isaiah held Ruby tight as she trembled, her sobs muffled against his shoulder, her fingers digging into his back like she could anchor herself to him. He wanted to chase after them, to fight back, to scream into the void. But he knew better. Out there in the dark, they'd kill him and call it justice. Instead, he helped Ruby sweep up the shards, their hands shaking as they worked in silence, the weight of the attack settling like lead in their bones. The trailer, their little sanctuary in a town that despised them, was scarred now, its walls a canvas for Crestwood's bigotry. Isaiah's victory in court had poked a hornet's nest, and this was just the first sting. He could feel it in his gut, a cold certainty that worse was coming. As he boarded up the windows with scraps of plywood, his mind churned with questions. How far would they go to break him? Would Ruby be safe if he kept fighting? Could he even survive Crestwood's wrath? Comment number 1 if you think Isaiah's win in court should have been the end of his troubles. Hit that like button if you're rooting for him to keep fighting. And subscribe to see how this battle unfolds, because this story's just getting started. What do you think happens when a small win lights a fire under a town like Crestwood? Stick around to find out. Isaiah Carter woke to the sound of Ruby humming an old gospel tune in the kitchen, the smell of burnt toast creeping through the trailer despite the boarded-up windows and the faint tang of spray paint still lingering in the air. It had been 2 days since the mob attacked their home. 2 days since his courtroom win turned to ash in his mouth, and the weight of Crestwood's hatred pressed heavier than ever. He rubbed his eyes, sore from sleepless nights, and forced himself out of bed, pulling on a faded hoodie and jeans that had seen better days. Ruby glanced over as he shuffled in, her smile tight but warm, and slid a plate of toast and scrambled eggs across the counter. She didn't say much about the attack, just murmured something about God seeing them through, but Isaiah could see the strain in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she poured coffee into a chipped mug. He wanted to promise her it would get better, that he'd fix this somehow, but the words stuck in his throat like dry bread. Instead, he hugged her quick and headed out, determined to reclaim some piece of normalcy at Crestwood High. School was his lifeline, the one place he'd always felt halfway safe, where his straight A grades and knack for debate earned him nods from teachers, even if the other kids kept their distance. As he walked the 1.5 miles to campus, the late summer heat already sticking his shirt to his back, he let himself imagine a day of algebra equations and history notes, a day where he wasn't the town's punching bag. That hope lasted all of 10 minutes. He stepped into the main hall, the buzz of chatter and slamming lockers hitting him like a wave, but the air shifted as eyes turned his way. Kids who'd once tossed him a casual head nod now looked through him, their whispers, sharp as glass. He caught fragments of their words: thug, troublemaker, jailbird, each one a jab that made his jaw clench tighter. By second period, he noticed the teachers avoiding his gaze too, their usual encouragement replaced with clipped responses or outright silence. At lunch, he sat alone under the big oak tree out back, the usual crew of debate club nerds nowhere to be found, their empty spots at the table a silent rejection that stung worse than any slur. Then came the hammer. Just before last period, the principal's voice crackled over the intercom, summoning Isaiah to the office. He walked the long hallway, every step heavier than the last, feeling the weight of 100 stairs boring into his back. Principal Edgar Rollins waited behind his desk, a stout white man with thinning hair and a tie knotted too tight, his mouth set in a grim line. Rollins was Judge Harold Whitaker's golf buddy, a fact everybody in Crestwood knew but nobody said out loud, and his presence in that oak-paneled office felt like a trap sprung shut. He didn't invite Isaiah to sit, just slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, the word expulsion stamped in bold red at the top. Isaiah's heart dropped into his stomach as Rollins launched into a rehearsed spiel about how Isaiah's recent behavior, specifically the drug rumors and the disruption they caused, violated the school's code of conduct. The words community, harmony came up more than once, each mention laced with a venom that made Isaiah's fists curl at his sides. He tried to argue, pointing out the charges were dropped, that he'd been framed, that he had a right to an education same as anybody else, but Rollins cut him off with a wave of his hand, saying the decision was final and non-negotiable. Isaiah stood there, the paper trembling in his grip, his mind racing for a way out. but Rollins was already ushering him to the door, muttering about cleaning out his locker before security got involved. The walk back through the halls felt like a gauntlet, every snicker and sidelong glance a fresh cut. By the time he reached his locker, the bell had rung, and the corridor was a swarm of kids heading to their last classes. He shoved his books into his backpack, ignoring the ache in his chest when he overheard a group of juniors nearby, their voices loud enough to carry. They were talking about the mob attack, about the viral video some kid had posted online, grainy footage of Billy Ray and his crew smashing windows and spray-painting slurs on the trailer. Isaiah's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen it yet, hadn't wanted to, but now he couldn't unhear their words. The video had been edited, they said, chopped up to make it look like Isaiah started the fight, like he'd thrown the first brick and provoked the whole mess. They laughed about it, one girl saying he probably deserved worse, and Isaiah felt the blood drain from his face. He didn't have a phone on him, confiscated in juvie and not yet replaced, so he couldn't check the damage himself, but the thought of that lie spreading like wildfire made his knees weak. He slung his bag over his shoulder, head down, and made for the exit, hoping to slip out before anyone else noticed him. That's when he saw the crowd outside the school doors, a knot of kids gathered around a phone, their gasps and whispers drawing more in like flies. He edged closer, against his better judgment, and caught a glimpse of the screen over some freshman's shoulder. There he was, distorted in pixelated glory. The video looped to show him yelling something at Billy Ray's crew, his face twisted in anger, while the clip conveniently cut off before the first window shattered. The caption read, "Local delinquent, attacks neighbors," and the comments below were a cesspool of hate, folks calling for his arrest, his deportation worse. Isaiah turned away, bile rising in his throat, and hurried out the back gate before the crowd could spot him. Back home he told Ruby about the expulsion, watching her face crumple as she sank into their threadbare couch, her hands twisting in her lap. She didn't cry this time, just stared at the floor, murmuring that they'd figure something out, but Isaiah could hear the defeat in her voice. He couldn't sit still, couldn't let this stand, so he spent the next 2 days drafting a petition to reverse the expulsion, pouring every ounce of his frustration into careful words about fairness and rights. He went door to door in the trailer park, then to the few teachers he thought might listen, like Miss Harper from English class, who'd always told him he had a gift for words. By Friday, he'd gathered 20 signatures, a small stack of hope, scrawled in shaky handwriting, folks who still believed in him despite the town's poison. He planned to present it at the school board meeting next week, a last-ditch effort to claw back his future. That hope died quick. Saturday morning, he woke to find his locker at the community center, where he'd been storing the petition while volunteering, pried open and trashed. The papers were gone, shredded into confetti that littered the floor like a cruel snow, and scrawled across the metal door in black marker was a single word: leave. But it was the noose hanging inside. That stopped his breath cold. A rough rope loop swaying slightly in the draft, its message clearer than any slur. Isaiah's hands shook as he tore it down, the coarse fibers scraping his palms, and he stood there in the empty gym, the weight of Crestwood's hate pressing down harder than ever. His school was gone, his friends were gone, and now even his fight felt like a losing battle. How much more could they take from him before there was nothing left? Isaiah Carter stood in the dim light of the community center gym, the torn noose crumpled in his trembling fist, the shredded remains of his petition scattered across the cold floor like a cruel mockery of his fight. The word "leave" scrawled on his locker burned into his mind, a jagged reminder of Crestwood's unrelenting hate, and the weight of it all threatened to crush him where he stood. It had been 4 days since his expulsion from Crestwood High, 4 days since the viral video twisted the mob attack to paint him as the villain, and the town's venom had only grown sharper, slicing deeper into his life with every passing hour. He stuffed the noose into his backpack, not wanting Ruby to see it when he got home, and swept the confetti of his petition into a trash bin, each scrap a dagger in his chest. He'd fought so hard for those signatures, 20 names of folks who'd believed in him despite the lies, and now they were gone, erased by someone who wanted him broken. As he trudged back to the trailer park, the late September sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, Isaiah felt the fight draining out of him, his shoulders slumping under an invisible burden. He didn't know how much more he could take, how many more blows he could dodge before one landed square and ended him for good. But then, like a faint beacon through the fog, a glimmer of hope appeared. Her name was Marla Evans, a 42-year-old black activist who'd moved to Crestwood 3 years back after a stint organizing in Birmingham. Isaiah had seen her around, always with a clipboard and a fierce glint in her eye, rallying folks. At the farmer's market or passing out flyers at the Baptist church, Ruby dragged him to every Sunday. Word of Isaiah's plight had reached her through the grapevine, whispers of a kid framed by the sheriff, expelled by the school, and terrorized by a mob, all for daring to stand up in court. Marla tracked him down at the trailer park the next morning, knocking on their door just as Ruby was frying bacon for breakfast. She stood on the sagging porch in a denim jacket and boots, her locks pulled back tight, her face a mix of determination and empathy as she introduced herself. Over cups of weak coffee at the kitchen table, Marla listened as Isaiah recounted everything. The false drug charge, the courtroom win, the mob attack, the expulsion, the noose. Ruby sat beside him, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles paled, nodding along but saying little, her eyes darting to the boarded-up windows every few minutes, like she expected another brick to come flying through. Marla didn't flinch, didn't look away. She took notes in a spiral pad, her pen scratching furiously, and when Isaiah finished, she leaned back and said she believed him, plain and simple. That alone felt like a lifeline, the first real kindness from a stranger in weeks. Marla laid out a plan. She'd fund a private tutor to keep Isaiah's education on track while they built a discrimination lawsuit against Crestwood High. She had contacts, she said, folks in Montgomery who could help with legal fees, and she'd already started digging into the school's history of biased policies, like how they'd suspended black kids at triple the rate of white ones for the same infractions. Isaiah felt a spark reignite in his chest, a flicker of the fire he'd thought was snuffed out, and he nodded, agreeing to meet her at the library every evening to gather evidence. Ruby squeezed his hand under the table, her smile small but real, and for the first time in days, Isaiah let himself believe they might claw their way out of this pit. Marla didn't stop there. She organized a small protest outside the school board office, a modest gathering of 30 folks, mostly black and Latino parents who'd seen their own kids chewed up by the system, plus a few white allies who'd read about Isaiah online and smelled the stench of injustice from miles away. They stood on the sidewalk under a gray October sky, holding signs that read, "Justice for Isaiah" and "Stop Racist Expulsions," their voices rising in chants that echoed off the brick building. Isaiah stood beside Marla, clutching a megaphone she'd thrust into his hands, his voice hoarse as he spoke about the noose, the lies, the way Crestwood High had stolen his future without a second thought. A handful of passers-by stopped to listen, some nodding along, others snapping photos, and a local blogger live-streamed the whole thing, her shaky footage racking up a few hundred views by sundown. For a fleeting moment, Isaiah felt untouchable, like he was part of something bigger, a movement that could shift the ground beneath Crestwood's rotten core. He went home that night with a lightness in his step, replaying the chants in his head, imagining the school board squirming when Marla slapped the lawsuit papers on their desk at the hearing tomorrow. He fell asleep on the couch, a textbook still open on his lap, dreaming of a future where he didn't have to fight just to breathe. That dream shattered at 3 a.m, with a boom that shook the trailer park like a thunderclap. Isaiah jolted awake, his heart slamming against his ribs, as Ruby screamed from her bedroom, her voice raw with panic. He stumbled to the window, yanking back the curtain just in time to see a fireball bloom in the darkness, a twisted skeleton of metal engulfed in flames where Marla's beat-up sedan had been parked on the street. The heat hit him through the glass, a wave of searing air that made his eyes water, and the stench of burning rubber and gasoline flooded his nose as shouts erupted from neighboring trailers. Folks spilled out in pajamas and robes, some clutching phones, others dragging kids back from the blaze, their faces pale in the flickering light. Isaiah threw on his sneakers and bolted outside, Ruby on his heels, her nightgown flapping as she yelled for him to stay back. But he couldn't. He had to know if Marla was in there, if she was hurt, if she was alive. The car was a roaring inferno. By the time he got close, flames licking 10 feet high and the crackle of melting plastic drowned out the wail of distant sirens. Through the haze of smoke, he saw Marla staggering out of her trailer across the street, her face smeared with soot, her left arm cradled against her chest like it was broken. She'd been outside when the bomb went off. She gasped to Isaiah as he helped her sit on the curb, her voice shaking but her eyes blazing with fury. She'd heard a noise, gone to check, and barely made it 10 steps before the explosion knocked her flat. If she'd been closer, she'd be ash. The fire trucks arrived too late to save the car, but they kept the blaze from spreading, hosing. Down the wreckage while paramedics loaded Marla onto a stretcher, her face grey with pain as they sped her to the county hospital. Isaiah stood frozen, the heat still prickling his skin, as Sheriff Lyle Tatum rolled up in his cruiser, his buzz cut glinting under the streetlights. Tatum didn't bother with condolences. He marched straight to Isaiah, his boots crunching on charred debris, and slapped cuffs on him before Ruby could get a word out. Inciting violence, Tatum growled, claiming witnesses saw Isaiah near the car just before it blew, a lie so bold it made Isaiah's blood boil. Ruby screamed after them as they shoved him into the cruiser, her voice cracking with despair, but the door slammed shut, cutting her off. At the station, they tossed him back into the same stinking cell he'd thought he'd escaped, the concrete colder than ever against his back. The charge was a sham, another frame job, but the weight of it crushed the hope Marla had given him. As he sat there, staring at the scratched names on the walls, he wondered if fighting back was worth it when every step forward dragged him 2 steps deeper into hell. Comment number 1 if you think Marla's bravery deserved better than a bomb in the night. Hit that like button if you're raging at Crestwood's dirty tricks, and subscribe to see Isaiah's next move, because this fight's far from over. How do you reckon a kid like Isaiah keeps going when the whole town's out for blood? Stick around to find out. Isaiah Carter sat in the Crestwood County Detention Center, the cold steel bench biting into his thighs, the echo of Marla Evans' car exploding still ringing in his ears like a gunshot that wouldn't fade. It had been 3 days since Sheriff Lyle Tatum slapped cuffs on him for inciting violence, a charge as flimsy as the paper it was written on, but heavy enough to lock him back in this hellhole. The cell block smelled of rust and despair, the walls scratched with curses from kids who'd come before him, and every clang of a door made his heart jump, expecting another setup, another lie to bury him deeper. He hadn't seen Marla since. The paramedics carted her off, her arm twisted at a sick angle, her face grey with shock but her eyes still burning with that fierce resolve. Word from Ruby was that she'd survived barely, with a shattered elbow and burns across her back, now laid up in the county hospital under guard like she was the criminal, not the victim. Isaiah's hands clenched into fists at the thought, nails digging into his palms, the sting a distraction from the rage boiling inside him. He'd been here before, caged on false charges after the drug plant, and he'd fought his way out with nothing but his wits and a law book. He'd do it again, even if it meant staring down the devil himself. That devil came in the form of Judge Harold Whitaker, the same racist who'd sneered at him after the vandalism acquittal, the same one pulling strings to keep Crestwood's black folks under his boot. The pre-trial hearing for the incitement charge was set for a muggy Monday morning, the air thick with the threat of rain, as Isaiah was marched into the courtroom in shackles, his orange jumpsuit itching against his skin. The gallery was packed. Tighter than a sardine can, folks craning their necks to see the kid who dared defy the system twice now. Ruby sat in the front row, her face drawn, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots, her eyes locked on Isaiah like she could will him free through sheer love. The prosecutor, Vernon Hayes, adjusted his silk tie with a smirk, ready to bury Isaiah in a grave of fabricated evidence, while Whitaker took his seat at the bench, his gavel cracking like a warning shot. The old judge's eyes narrowed as they met Isaiah's, a glint of malice there that made Isaiah's stomach churn, but he squared his shoulders and stood tall, refusing to let the man see him break. With no lawyer and no faith in the public defender system, Isaiah had declared he'd represent himself again, a decision that drew gasps from the gallery and a scoff from Whitaker, who muttered something about fools and defenses that nobody quite caught but everybody understood. Hayes opened with a venomous statement, claiming Isaiah had orchestrated the bombing as a stunt to gain sympathy, painting him as a dangerous agitator who'd radicalized Marla into chaos. The jury, a mix of skeptical white faces and one young Latino man who looked half asleep, listened with blank expressions, their boredom a wall Isaiah had to break through. When it was his turn, Isaiah stood, his voice steady despite the tremor, in his hands, and declared he'd cross-examined Tatum himself to prove the charge was a sham. The gallery buzzed as Tatum took the stand, his buzz cut glistening under the courtroom lights, his smirk as wide as the Alabama sky. Isaiah didn't waste time. He launched into his questions with a precision honed from nights of sleepless study, asking Tatum to recount the night of the bombing step by step. Tatum claimed he'd seen Isaiah lurking near Marla's car at 2 in the morning, a full hour before the explosion, and had witnesses who'd swear to it. Isaiah pressed harder, asking for names, times, specifics, watching Tatum's story unravel, like a cheap sweater. The sheriff stumbled over details, claiming one witness was an anonymous tipster, then backtracking to say it was a neighbor who'd changed their mind, his answers shifting like quicksand under Isaiah's relentless probing. Isaiah didn't stop there. He pulled out a timeline he'd scratched onto a legal pad, showing he'd been asleep in his trailer when Tatum's so-called sighting occurred, backed by Ruby's testimony and a time-stamped receipt from a late-night gas run they'd made together earlier that evening. The jury's eyes sharpened, the Latino man sitting up straighter, as Isaiah pointed out the lack of physical evidence tying him to the bomb, no fingerprints, no residue, nothing but Tatum's word, which was worth less than the dirt on his boots. Hayes objected every chance he got, his face growing redder with each overruled call. But Whitaker couldn't hide the flicker of unease in his jowls as the room tilted in Isaiah's favor. The gallery whispered, some folks shaking their heads. In disbelief, others glaring daggers at Isaiah for daring to challenge their sheriff. By the end of the cross-examination, Tatum was sweating bullets, his smirk gone, his answers reduced to mumbles, and Isaiah felt a surge of triumph as he sat down, the jury's murmurs a quiet victory in themselves. Whitaker slammed his gavel. For order. His face a storm cloud and called a recess, his voice tight with barely concealed rage as he swept out of the courtroom, robes billowing like a vulture's wings. Isaiah exhaled, his shoulders sagging, thinking maybe he'd cracked the case wide open, maybe this time the truth would stick. But Crestwood wasn't done with him yet. That night, as the sky outside his cell window turned a bruised purple, Ruby came to visit, her eyes red and puffy, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the glass separating them. She didn't say much at first, just looked at him with a sorrow that cut deeper than any blade, and then she told him what had happened while he'd been tearing Tatum apart in court. The county hospital, where Ruby had worked as a janitor for 17 years, had called her into the administrator's office just after lunch. The administrator, a pinched-faced white woman named Clara Hensley, who'd always treated Ruby like she was invisible, sat behind a polished desk and told her they were letting her go, effective immediately. No severance, no notice, just a pink slip and a cold explanation about budget cuts that didn't explain why Ruby's co-worker, a white woman with half her seniority, was keeping her job. Ruby had begged, her voice breaking as she explained she had a son to feed, bills to pay, a life to hold together. But Hensley wouldn't budge, muttering something about Ruby's association with a known troublemaker being bad for the hospital's image. Isaiah's heart sank as Ruby spoke, her words tumbling out between sobs, her handkerchief soaked through as she pressed it to her face. It wasn't budget cuts, it was retaliation, plain and simple, a message from Whitaker and his cronies that they'd hit Isaiah where it hurt most. Ruby broke down then, her shoulders shaking as she whispered that maybe he should stop fighting, that maybe they should leave Crestwood, start over somewhere else before they lost everything. Isaiah wanted to scream, to punch the glass, to tear down the whole damn town, but he just pressed his hand to the barrier, his voice steady as he told her he'd fix this, he'd get her job back. He wouldn't let them win. She nodded, trying to believe him, but as she left, her steps slow and heavy, Isaiah felt the weight of her words settle like lead in his gut. His courtroom win had cost them more than he'd ever imagined, and the price kept climbing. He sat, back on the steel bench, staring at the cracked ceiling, his mind racing despite the exhaustion pulling at him. How much more could they take? How much more would Crestwood demand before it was satisfied? He didn't know, but he knew one thing. He wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Not even close. The truth was out there, jagged and sharp, and he'd keep cutting with it until it bled justice or buried him trying. Isaiah Carter sat in the dim glow of Crestwood County's detention center, the flickering fluorescent light casting jagged shadows across the concrete walls, his mind racing faster than a jackrabbit on a hot tin roof. It had been 3 days since his courtroom showdown with Sheriff Lyle Tatum, 3 days since he'd sliced through the sheriff's lies with a scalpel of logic, leaving the jury murmuring and Judge Harold Whitaker's face redder than a July tomato. The taste of that small victory lingered, bitter and fleeting, overshadowed by Ruby's tear-streaked confession about losing her job at the hospital, a cruel jab from Whitaker's allies that hit harder than any cell door slamming shut. Isaiah's fingers traced the edge of a crumpled legal pad on his lap, the pages filled with notes scribbled in pencil stubs he'd begged off a guard, each word a lifeline in the storm Crestwood kept brewing around him. He'd been charged with inciting, violence over Marla Evans' car bombing, a frame job as obvious as the sun in the sky, but proving it was like catching smoke with bare hands. Still, he'd found something. A crack in the system's armor, buried in a late-night conversation with a jittery cellmate named Darnell, a 19-year-old who'd been nabbed for boosting car radios, but had ears sharper than a hawk's eyes. Darnell had overheard Tatum bragging in a bar 2 weeks back, slurring over a fifth of whiskey about how he'd taken care of that Carter kid, with a little fire and a lot of lies, laughing like it was a game he'd already won. Isaiah didn't have proof, not yet, but he'd convinced Darnell to whisper the story into a borrowed recorder from the detention library, a clunky old thing that hissed and popped but captured every damning word. He'd hidden the tape in a slit he'd carved into his mattress, knowing it was gold, knowing it could blow the case wide open if he played it right. The next court date loomed like a thunderhead, a Tuesday morning with air so thick it felt like breathing molasses, and Isaiah walked into the courtroom with the tape burning a hole in his pocket, handed over to the bailiff with a whispered plea to keep it safe. The gallery buzzed louder than a beehive, folks elbowing for space, their whispers a mix of curiosity and contempt, as Isaiah took his place at the defense table, still in his faded orange jumpsuit, still representing himself, because no lawyer in Crestwood would touch him with a 10-foot pole. Ruby sat in the front row again, her eyes hollow but fierce, her hands clutching a rosary like it could shield them from the storm. Judge Whitaker swept in, his robes a dark omen, his glare fixed on Isaiah like a hawk spotting prey. But Isaiah held his ground, his voice steady as he called for the tape to be played as evidence. The bailiff handed it to the clerk, who slotted it into an ancient player with a click that echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence. Darnell's voice crackled through the speakers, raw and shaky, recounting Tatum's drunken boast about framing, Isaiah about the bomb, about making sure his kind stayed down. The courtroom froze, a collective breath held as the words sank in, each one a hammer blow to the prosecution's flimsy case. The jury's eyes widened, the older white folks shifting uncomfortably, the young Latino man nodding slowly like he'd known all along. Vernon Hayes, the prosecutor, shot to his feet, his face purple, shouting objections about hearsay and chain of custody, but Isaiah countered with a precedent he'd memorized, arguing the tape's admissibility under exceptions, for statements against interest. Whitaker's jowls quivered, his knuckles white around the gavel, and for the first time Isaiah saw something like fear flicker across the old judge's face. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some folks gasping, others muttering slurs under their breath, but Isaiah didn't care. He'd landed a hit, a real one, and the jury's faces told him they felt it too. Whitaker slammed his gavel hard enough to crack wood, calling for order, his voice a snarl as he recessed for the day, claiming he needed to review the evidence. Isaiah exhaled, his knees weak as he sat, thinking maybe, just maybe, he'd turned the tide for good this time. But Crestwood's justice wasn't justice at all, and the night proved it colder than a winter ditch. Isaiah was back in his cell, counting cracks in the ceiling to keep his mind off Ruby's hollow eyes, when a guard rapped on the bars at midnight, his face pale as he whispered that the evidence locker had been compromised. The tape was gone, vanished like it had never existed, and by morning Vernon Hayes was in court with a new story, accusing Isaiah of tampering with evidence to fabricate his defense. The jury's faces darkened with doubt again, the Latino man's nod replaced with a frown, and Isaiah's stomach churned as Hayes pushed for a mistrial, claiming Isaiah's deceptions had tainted the proceedings. Whitaker didn't even pretend to be fair. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk curling his lips, and denied the mistrial only to keep Isaiah on the hook, letting Hayes's accusations hang like a noose over the courtroom. Isaiah argued back, his voice hoarse but unbroken, pointing out the lack of proof against him, the improbability of a kid in lockup sneaking into a guarded locker, but the damage was done. The jury's trust wavered, and Whitaker's smirk grew, wider, a predator smelling blood. As if that weren't enough, the outside world struck harder still. That evening, alone in his cell with no tape and no hope, Isaiah got word from a sympathetic guard about a new nightmare unfolding beyond the bars. A white supremacist group, some outfit called the Sons of Dixie, had caught wind of the trial and decided to make Isaiah their next target. They doxed him online, plastering his name, his mama's name, their trailer park address across hate-filled forums, their posts dripping with threats of ropes and fire and worse. Isaiah's cellmate showed him a printout smuggled in by another guard, a screenshot of a message board where faceless cowards called for his head, one post detailing how they'd finish what the bomb started. The guard had overheard chatter about burner phones being used to flood Isaiah's old number with death threats, voicemails so vile they made the man's hands shake as he relayed them. Ruby had no choice but to ditch her own phone, the one lifeline they'd had, and now she and Isaiah were hiding out in a cheap motel on the edge of town, using fake names and paying cash, jumping at every creak in the night. Ruby hadn't told. Him herself couldn't risk a visit with the threats circling like vultures, but the guard passed along her message. Stay safe, keep fighting, don't let them win. Isaiah clutched the printout, his knuckles pale, his breath shallow as the walls closed in tighter than ever. The tape was gone, the jury was slipping, and now his life, Ruby's life, hung by a thread thinner than a spider's silk. He'd thought the courtroom was his battlefield, but Crestwood had turned it into a war zone and he was running out of armor. Comment number 1 if you think the system's theft of that tape proves it's rigged against kids like Isaiah. Hit that like button if you're stunned at how low they'll stoop, and subscribe to catch every twist in this fight, because it's only getting darker. What happens when a kid's last piece of proof vanishes and the wolves start circling closer? Stick around to find out. Isaiah Carter sat hunched in his cell, the thin mattress beneath him sagging under his weight, the air heavy with the stench of stale sweat and mold that clung to Crestwood County's detention center like a second skin. It had been 4 days since the tape of Sheriff Lyle Tatum's drunken confession vanished from the evidence locker, 4 days since the Sons of Dixie plastered his name across their hate-filled forums, turning his life into a target painted red for every bigot with a grudge. The death threats kept coming, whispered through guards who overheard burner phone messages meant to break him, words so vile they made his stomach churn even as he tried to push them out of his mind. Ruby was holed up in a motel 20 miles out, her voice trembling through a smuggled note passed by a sympathetic guard, begging him to stay safe, to keep his head down. But Isaiah couldn't stop fighting, not now, not when every blow from Crestwood only sharpened his resolve to a razor's edge. He'd lost the tape, lost the jury's fleeting trust, but he still had his brain, and he'd use it to claw his way out of this pit, even if it meant digging through the dirt with his bare hands. A flicker of hope came in the form of Deputy Carl Hensley, a wiry white man in his late 20s, who'd been on the force just long enough to see Tatum's corruption up close, but not long enough to be fully poisoned by it. Hensley had been at the bombing scene, one of the few who didn't sneer when Isaiah got cuffed, and over the past week he'd slipped Isaiah small favors, an extra sandwich at lunch, a pencil stub when the guards weren't looking, a nod that said he wasn't like the rest. Late one night, as the cell block fell quiet save for the snores of Isaiah's cellmate, Hensley appeared at the bars, his face pale in the dim light, his voice low as he slid a burner phone through the slot. On it were photos, grainy but damning. Tatum planting something in Marla's car hours before the explosion, his buzz cut unmistakable under a street lamp's glow, a smirk on his face as he rigged the device that nearly killed her. Isaiah's heart raced as he scrolled through the images, his fingers trembling. This was it, the proof he needed to bury Tatum, to prove the incitement charge was a sham stitched together with lies and hate. He whispered thanks to Hensley, who just nodded, his eyes darting down the hall like he expected Tatum to materialize out of the shadows, and told Isaiah to use it in court tomorrow, to make it count. Isaiah barely slept that night, the phone hidden beneath his mattress, his mind replaying every angle of how he'd present this, how he'd turn the jury back to his side. The courtroom buzzed with tension the next morning, a Friday with air. So thick it felt like breathing soup. The gallery packed with folks who'd come to see the black kid either crumble or pull off another miracle. Ruby wasn't there. The motel's distance and the threats kept her away. But Isaiah could feel her prayers like a shield around him as he stood at the defense table, the burner phone handed over to the bailiff with a plea to keep it secure. Judge Harold Whitaker took his seat, his jowls quivering with disdain, his eyes narrowing as Isaiah requested to present new evidence. Vernon Hayes, the prosecutor, scoffed, adjusting his tie like he was already counting his win. But Isaiah held, his ground, his voice steady as he described the photos, calling Hensley to the stand to authenticate them. Hensley walked in, his steps hesitant, his uniform crisp but his face pale, and for a moment Isaiah thought he saw a flicker of guilt in the deputy's eyes. That flicker turned to a flood when the photos played on a courtroom projector, Tatum's, face clear as day, his hands working something into Marla's car door, the timestamp showing 2 hours before the explosion. The jury gasped, the gallery erupted in whispers, and even Whitaker's gavel couldn't silence the shock rippling through the room. Isaiah pressed Hensley on the details, where he'd been, what he'd seen, why he'd taken the photos, and Hensley answered, his voice shaky but firm, confirming he'd followed Tatum that night on a hunch, knowing the sheriff had it out for Isaiah. The jury's faces shifted, doubt melting into belief, the older white folks frowning like they'd tasted something sour, the young Latino man nodding like he'd been waiting for this all along. Isaiah sat down, his chest tight with hope, thinking, maybe this time he'd landed a blow they couldn't dodge. Whitaker called a recess, his face a storm cloud, his gavel slamming harder than necessary, and Isaiah exhaled, feeling the room tilt in his favor for the first time in weeks. But Crestwood's claws were sharper than he'd reckoned, and they struck fast. That afternoon, as Isaiah waited in a holding cell for the trial to resume, a guard delivered a bombshell. Hensley had recanted publicly, claiming Isaiah had coerced him into planting the photos, saying he'd been threatened into testifying by outside agitators tied to Marla's activism. The news hit Isaiah like a freight train, his knees buckling as he sank onto the bench, his mind reeling at the betrayal. Hensley had seemed solid, haunted but honest, and now he'd flipped, leaving Isaiah's new evidence tainted with lies. The jury wouldn't trust it now, not with Hensley backtracking, and Hayes would feast on the retraction like a vulture on carrion. Isaiah's hands shook as he tried to piece together why Hensley turned. Fear, probably, or a deal from Tatum. Maybe Whitaker himself, leaning hard enough to break the man's spine. Whatever it was, it left Isaiah dangling by a thread, his hope snuffed out like a candle in a hurricane. The worst came that night, a blow so vicious it made the courtroom betrayal feel like a paper cut. Ruby had called the detention center from the motel, her voice a whisper through the static of a borrowed line, and the guard relayed her message with a grimace that told Isaiah it wasn't good. At 11 that night, as Isaiah had been staring at the ceiling trying to salvage his defense, a Molotov cocktail had crashed through the motel window where Ruby was hiding, the bottle shattering on the cheap carpet and igniting a blaze that roared to life in seconds. Ruby had been awake, thank God, reading her Bible by a flickering lamp, and she'd grabbed her purse and bolted out the door as flames licked at her heels, the heat searing her arms as she stumbled into the parking lot. The motel clerk, a wiry, Kid barely out of high school had seen the whole thing. Said two men in hoods tossed the bottle and ran, their laughter echoing into the night before sirens wailed in the distance. Ruby was unharmed physically, but the motel room was gutted. Their few belongings ash, and she'd had to flee to another spot, this time a shelter in Montgomery, scraping by on charity and prayers. Isaiah listened to the guard's words, his chest so tight he could barely breathe, his fists clenched until his nails drew blood. The fire wasn't random. It was Crestwood's doing, Whitaker's doing. A message burned into the night that if Isaiah kept fighting, they'd burn everything he loved to the ground. He and Ruby escaped with their lives, but the motel was a charred ruin, a testament to how far the town would go to crush him. As he lay on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, Isaiah felt the walls closing in tighter than ever, the betrayal and the fire, a 1-2 punch that left him reeling. But even in the dark, a spark of defiance flickered. He wasn't done, not yet. Not while he still had breath to fight with. Isaiah Carter paced the cramped cell in Crestwood County's detention center, his sneakers scuffing the grimy concrete, the echo of the Molotov cocktail's roar still searing his mind like a fresh brand. It had been 2 days since Deputy Carl, Hensley's betrayal turned his courtroom evidence into a lie. 2 days since the firebomb torched the motel, where Ruby had been hiding, leaving her scrambling to a shelter in Montgomery with nothing but the clothes on her back and a Bible clutched tight. The guard's whispered update had come that morning, Ruby's voice relayed through a shaky message. She was safe, for now, but shaken to her core, her faith fraying at the edges as Crestwood's hate kept clawing at them. Isaiah's chest ached. With every breath, guilt and fury twisting together like barbed wire. Knowing his fight had put her in the crosshairs, knowing he couldn't stop even if it killed him. The incitement charge still hung over him, a noose tightening with every passing hour, and Hensley's recantation had left the jury teetering, their trust in him a threadbare rag ready to snap. But Isaiah wasn't done. He'd lost the photos, lost the tape, lost damn near everything. But he still had his voice, and he'd use it to scream until someone listened. The idea hit him like a lightning bolt in the dead of night, sparked by a memory of Marla Evans' protest outside the school board, the way those 30 souls had stood with him, despite the odds. If he could rally them again, louder, bigger, he might turn the tide, might make Crestwood choke on its own poison. He scribbled a plan on a scrap of paper, passing it to a guard who'd slipped him favors before, a grizzled black man named Otis, who'd nodded once and promised to get word to Marla's network in Montgomery. Isaiah didn't know if it would work, didn't know if anyone would show, but he had to try. Sitting still wasn't an option when the town was trying to burn him alive. 2 days later, as the sun dipped low over Crestwood, painting the sky a bloody red, it happened. A crowd gathered outside the courthouse, 50 strong at first, then swelling to 100 as word spread like wildfire through the trailer parks and back roads. They were black folks mostly, parents and kids who'd felt the sting of Whitaker's gavel, joined by a handful of Latino workers from the poultry plant and a few white college kids who'd driven down from Birmingham, their signs, scrawled with Free Isaiah and End Racist Justice in bold marker. Marla wasn't there, still laid up in the hospital with a shattered elbow, but her spirit crackled through the chants, her name shouted alongside Isaiah's as the crowd's voices rose in a defiant roar. Isaiah watched from a barred window. In the detention center, his heart pounding as he saw them march, their fists raised against the October chill, their signs waving like battle flags in the fading light. A local news van rolled up, its camera catching the scene live, and within hours the story hit national outlets, clips of the protest looping on screens from Atlanta to Chicago, hashtags like Justice for Isaiah trending as strangers thousands of miles away started typing his name. For a moment, Isaiah felt invincible, like the world was finally seeing Crestwood's rot, like he'd lit a match they couldn't snuff out. He leaned against the bars, his breath fogging the glass, letting himself believe he'd turned the corner, that this was the push he needed to break free. Then Whitaker struck back, and it hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. By midnight, as Isaiah lay on his cot counting cracks to stay sane, the guard slipped him a crumpled newspaper, the Crestwood Chronicle's late edition, its headline screaming "Gang leader incites chaos" in letters bold enough to bruise. The story spun a lie so twisted, it made Isaiah's blood run cold. A doctored video released by Whitaker's office showed him at the protest, his face distorted in grainy footage to look like he was shouting orders to a violent mob, not pleading for justice. The clip cut to scenes of broken windows and overturned trash cans, staged chaos pinned on Isaiah like a badge of guilt, claiming he'd rallied thugs to terrorize the town. The truth didn't matter. The video was a weapon, and Whitaker wielded it with surgical precision, turning public opinion into a howling storm of hate. By morning, the protest's glow had curdled into a nightmare. Whitaker's cronies, led by Billy Ray, Tatum's cousin with the Confederate tattoo, had orchestrated a riot to match the lie, gathering a mob of their own outside the courthouse as the real protesters dispersed. They wore hoods, carried bats and smashed car windows under the guise of retaliation, their shouts of slurs and threats drowning out the last echoes of Isaiah's rally. The news ate it up, looping the fake video alongside footage of the riot, painting Isaiah as the mastermind of a war he'd never started. Sheriff Tatum stood by, his deputies watching with smirks as the chaos unfolded, their radios silent while Billy Ray's crew rampaged unchecked. Isaiah got word of the fallout through Otis, who slipped into the cell block at dawn, his face grim as he described the scene. The courthouse steps littered with glass, a pickup truck torched in the parking lot, and a dozen arrests, none of them the real culprits. The town turned on Isaiah harder than ever, neighbors who'd wavered now spitting his name like a curse, the few allies he'd had shrinking back in fear of the backlash. Ruby called from the shelter, her voice a whisper through a borrowed phone, saying folks in Montgomery were starting to doubt her too, whispering she'd raised a monster who'd brought this on them all. Isaiah's knees buckled as Otis spoke, but the worst was yet to come. That afternoon, as he was shuffled to a holding cell for a hearing, the riot caught up to him in the flesh. A group of 5 men, white and burly, waited in the courthouse alley, their faces masked but their intent clear as they jumped him the second the guard turned away. They moved fast, fists slamming into his ribs, boots cracking against his legs, their grunts mixing with slurs as they beat him senseless. Isaiah curled into a ball, arms shielding his head, tasting blood as a punch split his lip, his vision blurring with every blow. The guard came back too late, shouting them off, but the damage was done. Isaiah lay crumpled on the asphalt, one eye swollen shut, his body a map of bruises, his breath ragged as pain shot through him like lightning. They hauled him to the county hospital, the same place that fired Ruby, and stitched him up without a word, Ruby's sobs echoing through a brief phone call as she begged him to stop fighting before they killed him. He woke in a hospital bed, the beep of a monitor steady against the ache in his bones, his good eye fixed on the ceiling as he replayed the protest, the video, the beating. Crestwood had turned his spark into a wildfire, then blamed him for the burn, and now he was broken, bleeding but not beaten. Not yet. Comment number 1. If you think Isaiah's protest should have been his ticket out, hit that like button if you're boiling at Whitaker's dirty video trick, and subscribe to see how he rises from this wreckage. Because this story's got more fight left. What happens when a town's lie leaves a kid bloody and alone? Stay tuned to find out. Isaiah Carter lay in a sterile hospital bed at Crestwood County Medical, the beep of the heart monitor, a steady drone against the throbbing pain that pulsed through his battered body. His left eye was swollen shut, a purple bloom of bruises spreading. Across his face, his ribs creaking with every shallow breath after the mob's brutal beating in the courthouse alley. It had been 12 hours since Billy Ray's crew left him crumpled on the asphalt. 12 hours since the guard dragged him here, blood dripping from his split lip onto the stretcher as Ruby's sobs echoed through a brief phone call from the Montgomery shelter. The stitches on his cheek itched under the harsh fluorescent lights, but his mind churned faster than his body could heal, replaying the protest turned riot, the doctored video that framed him, the fists that tried to silence him for good. He wasn't dead yet, and that meant he wasn't done fighting, even if Crestwood had broken nearly everything else. The incitement charge still loomed, a guillotine blade held by Judge Harold Whitaker's gnarled hands, and the trial was barreling toward a close with the jury teetering on the edge of doubt. Isaiah knew he had one shot left, one desperate play, to turn the tide, and it started with the judge himself. From his hospital bed, propped up on pillows that smelled of bleach and despair, he scratched out a motion on a legal pad, borrowed from a nurse who'd taken pity on his swollen hands. His fingers trembled, the pencil wobbling as he wrote, but his words were sharp. A motion to recuse Whitaker from the case, citing bias so blatant it could light up the night sky. He'd spent weeks piecing together the judge's history, whispers, from cellmates and snippets from old newspapers Ruby had mailed him before the motel burned. And now he had a dossier, a stack of evidence showing Whitaker's pattern of racist rulings stretching back decades. There was the 1998 case, where he'd sentenced a black teen to 10 years for stealing a candy bar, while letting a white kid walk for the same crime. The 2005 ruling that threw out a black woman's assault claim against a white cop with a wink to the badge. The dozens of times he'd piled extra years onto black defendants, like he was stacking firewood for a lynching pyre. Isaiah's handwriting was shaky, but his argument was ironclad. Whitaker couldn't judge him fairly, not with a record that screamed hate louder than any mob's slurs. He finished the motion at dawn, the sky outside his window a bruised grey, and handed it to the nurse with a plea to get it to the courthouse before the next hearing. She nodded, her eyes soft with something like respect, and Isaiah sank back into the pillows, exhaustion pulling at him like quicksand. 2 days later, they wheeled him back to court, his hospital gown swapped for a jumpsuit that hung loose on his bruised frame, his wrists cuffed despite the IV scars dotting his arms. The gallery was packed, the air thick with tension, and the sour smell of sweat, folks whispering as Isaiah rolled in, his wheelchair creaking under the weight of their stares. Ruby wasn't there, still hiding in Montgomery, but he felt her prayers like a heartbeat in his chest. Vernon Hayes, the prosecutor, smirked from his table, his tie a bright slash of red against his crisp suit, while Whitaker took the bench, his jowls quivering with barely concealed rage as Isaiah's motion hit the docket. Isaiah stood, wincing. As his ribs protested and argued his case, his voice hoarse but unbroken, laying out Whitaker's history like a map of Crestwood's shame. He cited dates, cases, outcomes, his words cutting through the room's murmur, and when he finished, he dropped a bombshell. A federal investigator from Birmingham had caught wind of the protest and the riot, and she was in the gallery now, a tall black woman in a grey blazer, her notebook open as she watched Whitaker squirm. The judge's face went pale, his gavel hovering mid-air, and the gallery erupted in gasps, some folks craning to see the investigator, others glaring at Isaiah like he'd summoned a ghost. Hayes leapt up, shouting objections about procedure and relevance, but Isaiah countered with a precedent he'd memorized in juvie, arguing the investigator's presence proved Whitaker's bias was under scrutiny beyond Crestwood's borders. The room held its breath as Whitaker leaned back, his eyes darting to the investigator, then to Isaiah, a flicker of panic breaking through his usual sneer. After a tense silence, Whitaker barked a ruling. He'd step down temporarily, pending a review, handing the case to Judge Evelyn Pierce, a younger white woman known as his protégé, a move that drew murmurs of relief and suspicion from the crowd. Isaiah exhaled, his knees trembling as he sank back into the wheelchair, a rush of triumph flooding his veins. Whitaker was off the bench, the investigator was watching, and for a moment he thought he'd finally landed a blow that stuck. But Crestwood's venom ran deeper than one judge, and the reprieve was a mirage. Judge Pierce took over the next day, her face a mask of cool indifference as she strode into the courtroom, her robes crisp and her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Isaiah hoped for fairness, prayed for a breath of clean air. But Pierce dashed that hope faster than a snake's strike. She opened the hearing with a ruling on Isaiah's bail, denying it outright despite his injuries, her voice clipped as she cited flight risk and ongoing threats to public safety, nodding to the doctored video like it was gospel. Hayes grinned, his teeth flashing while the jury's faces hardened. The flicker of doubt Isaiah had sparked snuffed out by Pierce's cold authority. She didn't stop there. She fast-tracked the trial, setting a closing date for the end of the week, giving Isaiah 3 days to mount a defense with no evidence, no allies, and a body still screaming from the beating. The gallery buzzed, some folks nodding approval, others shaking their heads, but Isaiah's stomach sank as he realized Pierce was Whitaker's shadow, a puppet with the same strings, her fairness a lie dressed up in a robe. The final blow came that night, whispered through Otis, the guard who'd become his lifeline to the outside. As Isaiah lay in his cell, the hospital bed swapped back for a cot that dug into his bruises. Otis slipped him a note under the bars, his face grim as he recounted what he'd overheard on the sheriff's radio. Whitaker hadn't just stepped down, he'd planted a hitman in juvie, a lifer named Big Tommy, a hulking white man with a swastika tattooed on his neck, paid off to silence Isaiah before he could testify again. Tommy had been transferred in that afternoon, his bunk 2 cells down, his eyes glinting with a promise of pain as he'd sized Isaiah up during rec time. Otis said the order came straight from Whitaker, a last-ditch move to bury the kid who'd dared expose him, and the guards were turning a blind eye, their silence bought with fear or cash. Isaiah clutched the note, his breath shallow, his good eye darting to the shadows beyond the bars where Tommy's hulking form loomed in the dark. The courtroom wind felt like ashes now, Whitaker's recusal a hollow victory when Pierce tightened. The noose and a killer waited in the wings. Isaiah's ribs ached, his hands shook, but his mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to survive long enough to fight another day. Crestwood wanted him dead, and they were running out of patience. Isaiah Carter lay on his cot in Crestwood County's juvie wing, the thin mattress doing little to cushion his bruised ribs, the air thick with the sour tang of fear that clung to him like damp fog. It had been 2 nights since Judge Harold Whitaker stepped down from his case, 2 nights since Judge Evelyn Pierce tightened the noose with her cold rulings, denying bail and fast-tracking the trial to bury him quick. The stitches on his cheek pulled tight every time he moved, a constant reminder of the mob's beating. But the real threat loomed closer now, a shadow pacing the cell block in the form of Big Tommy, the hitman Whitaker had planted to silence. Him. Tommy was a mountain of a man, 6'5" with a shaved head and a swastika tattoo curling up his thick neck, his eyes glinting with a predator's hunger whenever they locked on Isaiah during rec time. The guards knew. Otis had whispered it through the bars, his voice low and urgent, saying Tommy had been slipped a wad of cash and a promise of early parole to make sure Isaiah didn't live to testify again. The cell block buzzed with tension, the other kids steering clear, their whispers a low hum of dread, as Tommy cracked his knuckles loud enough to echo off the concrete walls. Isaiah slept with one eye open, his good eye at least, the other still swollen half shut, his heart pounding every time the shadows shifted beyond his bars. He knew it was coming, felt it in his bones, and when it hit fast. It was just past midnight, the cell block dim under flickering lights when Tommy made his move. Isaiah was dozing, exhaustion pulling him under despite his nerves, when the lock on his cell clicked open, a sound sharp enough to jolt him awake. Tommy loomed in the doorway, his bulk filling the frame, a shiv glinting in his fist, a crude blade carved from a toothbrush handle and sharpened to a wicked point. Isaiah scrambled upright, his ribs screaming as he pressed against the wall. His voice caught in his throat as Tommy lunged, the shiv slashing air inches from his chest. He dodged, barely, his sneakers slipping on the slick floor, and shouted. For the guards, his cry hoarse and desperate. But the hall stayed silent, the night shift conveniently deaf to his pleas. Tommy swung again, his breath hot and sour, the blade nicking Isaiah's arm, a thin line of blood blooming red against his skin. Panic surged, but Isaiah fought back, kicking at Tommy's knee with all he had, the crack of bone on bone loud, in the cramped space. Tommy grunted, stumbling just enough for Isaiah to duck past, but the hitman grabbed his collar, slamming him against the bars hard enough to rattle his teeth. The shiv rose again, aimed for his gut this time, and Isaiah braced for the end, his mind flashing to Ruby's face her prayers, her hope he'd never see again. Then a shout split the dark, a guard's voice barking orders as boots pounded down the hall. Otis burst in, his flashlight blinding as he tackled Tommy, wrestling the shiv from his grip with a roar that shook the cell block awake. 2 more guards piled on, pinning Tommy to the floor, his curses muffled as they cuffed him tight. Isaiah slumped against the wall, blood dripping from his arm, his chest heaving as the adrenaline drained out of him like water from a cracked jug. Otis hauled him to his feet, his grip firm but kind, muttering that he'd been on a hunch checking the block when he heard the scuffle. They patched Isaiah up in the infirmary, a nurse with tired eyes stitching his arm in silence, the sting of antiseptic sharp against the dull ache of his ribs. He was alive, barely, the shiv missing his vitals by inches, and as he sat there the reality sank in. Whitaker wanted him dead, and he wouldn't stop until it was done. Back in his cell, the bloodstains scrubbed clean, but the fear still thick. Isaiah whispered to Ruby through Otis, begging her to stay safe in Montgomery, to check every shadow twice. She got the message by noon. Her reply, a tear-stained note, slipped back through the guard, saying she'd found something in the chaos of their escape from the motel, something she'd hidden in a sock and forgotten until now. A USB drive Isaiah had stashed months ago, back when he first started digging into Whitaker's dirt. He'd recorded late-night talks with folks in the trailer park, old-timers who'd seen the judge's backroom deals with Tatum, hushed stories of payoffs and frame jobs that stretched back years. Isaiah's heart raced as Otis relayed Ruby's words. He'd thought the drive was lost in the fire, but there it was. A lifeline she'd mailed to the detention center under a fake name, tucked into a pack of socks that arrived that afternoon. He clutched it in his bandaged hand, the tiny black, a stick heavier than gold, knowing it could change everything if he played it right. The trial resumed the next day, a Wednesday with air so heavy it felt like breathing mud, and Isaiah rolled into court in a wheelchair, his arms slung and his face a map of bruises, the gallery buzzing as he handed the USB to the bailiff with a plea to play it. Judge Pierce's eyes narrowed, her lips a thin line, but she allowed it. Her voice clipped as the clerk plugged it into a laptop. The speakers crackled to life, voices spilling out. Old Mr. Jenkins from Lot 12, his gravelly tone recounting how Whitaker took cash from Tatum to lock up black teens on trumped-up charges, how they'd split the fines like pirates divvying loot. Miss Lena from the church, her whisper trembling as she described a deal to frame a kid for arson in 2010, all to clear land for a white developer. The recordings piled up, 6 voices total, each one a nail in Whitaker's coffin, exposing a conspiracy to profit off ruined lives, a machine that chewed up black kids like Isaiah for cash and control. The courtroom erupted, gasps turning to shouts, the jury's faces paling as the truth hit like a freight train. Vernon Hayes leapt up, his objections drowned by the noise, but Pierce banged her gavel, her composure cracking as she ordered silence. The federal investigator from Birmingham, still in the gallery, stood, her notebook snapping shut as she demanded Whitaker's arrest on the spot, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The gallery roared, some folks cheering, others cursing, but Isaiah's eyes locked on Pierce, waiting for her move. She recessed, her face a mask of fury, but the damage was done. The USB had blown the lid off Crestwood's rot, and Whitaker couldn't hide anymore. That night, as Isaiah lay in his cell, the adrenaline still buzzing, Otis slipped him word of the fallout. Whitaker had fled, bolted from his mansion in a pickup truck hours after the hearing, leaving orders for his network to torch Isaiah's evidence and their trailer as a final spiteful act. The trailer park went up in flames by midnight, a blaze that swallowed their home. Ruby's quilts, Isaiah's books, every scrap of their life reduced to ash, while firefighters stood by, their hoses idle under Tatum's glare. Isaiah's chest tightened, tears stinging his good eye, but he swallowed them down, his jaw set as he gripped the cot's edge. The USB had struck a blow, but Whitaker's escape and the arson hit back harder, leaving him with nothing but the fight still burning in his gut. Isaiah Carter sat in Crestwood County's juvie cell, the cold concrete seeping through his thin jumpsuit, his stitched arm throbbing under a bandage as the ashes of his trailer park home settled in his mind like a bitter dust. It had been 3 days since the USB drive's recordings tore through the courtroom, exposing Judge Harold Whitaker's conspiracy with Sheriff Lyle Tatum to frame black teens for profit. 3 days since Whitaker fled town in a pickup truck, leaving orders to burn Isaiah's world to the ground. The fire had gutted the trailer park overnight, swallowing Ruby's quilts, Isaiah's books, every scrap of their life in a roaring blaze while Tatum's deputies watched. their smirks glinting in the firelight. Otis, the guard who'd saved him from Big Tommy's shiv, had slipped him the news at dawn, his voice low and heavy, saying Ruby was safe in Montgomery but shattered, her sobs echoing through a borrowed phone as she mourned their home. Isaiah's chest ached, not just from the bruises or the stitches, but from the weight of knowing his fight had cost them everything, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fire in his gut that wouldn't die. The trial's endgame loomed now, a Thursday morning with air so thick it clung to the skin, and Isaiah knew this was his last stand, his final chance to turn Crestwood's poison back on itself. They wheeled him into court, his ribs still creaking from the beating, his good eye scanning the packed gallery where folks jostled for space, their whispers a mix of awe and venom. Ruby couldn't be there, the distance and threats keeping her in Montgomery, but Isaiah felt her prayers like a steady pulse as he faced Judge Evelyn Pierce, her face a mask of cold control behind the bench. The federal investigator from Birmingham sat in the back, her grey blazer stark against the crowd, her notebook open as she watched every move, a silent promise that Whitaker's flight wouldn't bury the truth. Vernon Hayes, the prosecutor, adjusted his tie with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, sensing blood in the water despite the USB's blow, ready to twist Isaiah's defiance into a conviction. Pierce banged her gavel, her voice sharp as she called the session to order, and Isaiah stood wincing as his stitches pulled, declaring he'd testify one last time to seal the case shut. Hayes smirked, thinking he'd trap Isaiah in a web of lies, but Isaiah had a plan, a blade sharpened by weeks of pain and a lifetime of grit. He took the stand, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, and turned the cross-examination into a guillotine for Tatum. Hayes opened with a barrage, asking why Isaiah had incited the bombing, why he'd fled from justice, but Isaiah flipped the script, calling Tatum to the stand as a hostile witness, a move Pierce allowed, with a reluctant nod after the USB's revelations. Tatum swaggered up, his buzz cut glinting under the lights, his smirk faltering as Isaiah launched in, his questions a relentless drumbeat. He asked about the night of the bombing, the planted drugs, the trailer park fire, each query backed by the USB's echoes, pinning Tatum to dates and times he couldn't dodge. Tatum squirmed, his answers tripping over themselves, claiming he'd been patrolling, then admitting he'd been nearby, his story crumbling like dry dirt under Isaiah's pressure. Isaiah didn't let up. He asked about the payoffs, the deals with Whitaker, the orders to torch the trailer, his voice rising as he recounted the recordings, daring Tatum to lie with the jury's eyes boring into him. The sheriff's face reddened, sweat beading on his brow, and then it happened. Tatum cracked, his voice breaking as he muttered that, yeah, he'd planted the bomb, yeah, he'd framed Isaiah, yeah, Whitaker had paid him to keep the system rolling, to keep kids like Isaiah locked up or dead for profit. The courtroom exploded, gasps turning to shouts, the gallery surging to its feet as Pierce's gavel slammed uselessly against the chaos. The jury's faces paled, the older white folks clutching their chairs, the young Latino man pumping a fist like he'd won a prize, and the federal investigator stood, her voice cutting through the din to demand Tatum's cuffs right there. Hayes slumped in his seat, his tie askew, his objections drowned by the uproar, and Isaiah sat back, his breath ragged, a flood of triumph washing over him as Tatum was hauled off the stand, his wrists cuffed by a deputy who couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Pierce called a recess, her face a storm of fury, but the jury didn't need long. They returned in an hour, their verdict ringing out clear as a bell in the packed room. Not guilty on all charges, incitement, possession, everything Crestwood had thrown at him. The gallery cheered, some folks weeping, others cursing, but Isaiah barely heard it, his head dropping into his hands as relief hit like a tidal wave, his body shaking with the weight of freedom he hadn't dared hope for. The cuffs came off, his wheelchair creaked as they rolled him out, and for a moment he let himself breathe, let himself believe it was over. But Crestwood wasn't finished carving its pound of flesh. As Isaiah exited the courthouse, the late October sun blinding after weeks of cell block gloom, a news van screeched up, its camera rolling live as chaos unfolded on the steps. Deputies swarmed Ruby, her frail frame dwarfed by their bulk, her wrists cuffed as she stumbled down from a bus she'd taken from Montgomery to see him free. The reporter shouted into the mic, her voice shrill. Ruby Carter, arrested for arson, suspected of torching the trailer park to cover her son's tracks, a charge so absurd it made Isaiah's blood boil. He lunged from the wheelchair, his ribs screaming, shouting her name as she looked back, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth forming a silent, "I'm sorry," before they shoved her into a cruiser. The crowd surged, some cheering the arrest, others yelling for her release, but Isaiah couldn't reach her, his legs buckling as deputies held him back, his voice raw as he screamed into the chaos. The news ticker flashed the lie across screens nationwide. Mother of acquitted teen charged in revenge fire, twisting his victory into a gut punch that left him gasping on the steps, his freedom tasting like ash in his mouth. Ruby hadn't burned anything. She'd been in Montgomery, miles away, but Whitaker's network had struck again, framing her to break him, to make sure every win came with a wound. The federal investigator pushed through the crowd, her face grim as she promised to dig into this, but Isaiah barely heard her, his eyes locked on the cruiser's taillights fading down the street, Ruby's silhouette shrinking into the distance. He'd beaten the charges, beaten Tatum, beaten Whitaker's courtroom, but they'd taken his mama, the one piece of his world he'd fought to protect, and the victory turned hollow, a shell of what he'd dreamed. He sank to the ground, the asphalt cold against his palms, his breath hitching as the fight drained out of him, replaced by a new fire, a vow to save her no matter what it took. Crestwood had won this round, but Isaiah wasn't done. He'd claw his way back for Ruby, for justice for every soul they'd tried to bury. Isaiah Carter stood on the cracked courthouse steps, the late October wind cutting through his thin jumpsuit, his ribs aching as he watched the tail lights of the sheriff's cruiser fade into the Crestwood dusk, carrying Ruby away in cuffs. The news van's camera lingered, its red light a cold eye capturing the chaos as reporters shouted into microphones, spinning the lie that Ruby had torched their trailer park in a vengeful blaze to cover Isaiah's tracks. His legs trembled, the stitches on his arm pulling tight under the bandage. His good eye burning with tears, he refused to let fall as the crowd's roar faded into a dull hum behind him. He'd beaten the incitement charge, beaten Sheriff Lyle Tatum's confession out of him, beaten Judge Harold Whitaker's courtroom, only to have his victory snatched away in a heartbeat, Ruby's arrest a dagger twisted deep by the same system he'd fought to dismantle. The federal investigator, a tall black woman in a grey blazer, pushed through the throng, her voice sharp as she promised to dig into this new frame job, her notebook clutched like a weapon, but Isaiah barely nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty street where his mama had vanished. Freedom felt like a hollow shell without her, the weight of her sacrifice crushing him harder than any mob's fists. He'd won his life back, but Crestwood had made sure he'd pay for it with hers, a final spit in the face from a town that thrived on breaking folks like them. The hospital released him that evening, his bruises a map of purple and yellow across his skin, his wheelchair swapped for a pair of crutches that clicked against the linoleum as he hobbled out. Otis, the guard who'd saved him from Big Tommy's shiv, drove him to a cheap motel on the edge of town, a different one from the firebombed wreck, his silence a comfort as Isaiah stared out the window, the blurred lights of Crestwood smearing, past like a bad dream. Ruby was locked up in the county jail now, held without bail on the arson charge, her frail frame no match for the cold cell block, her spirit battered by a lie she couldn't fight alone. Isaiah sank onto the motel's sagging bed, the springs groaning under him, and vowed to save her, to rip apart Whitaker's network until every last thread unraveled. He had no evidence left, no home, no money, but he had his mind, his fire, and a promise to Ruby that he'd never break. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, he sat up, the crutches propped against the wall, his good eye scanning a stack of papers Otis had smuggled from the detention center, scraps of notes he'd kept from weeks of digging. He needed more, needed proof to free Ruby, and he started with the only lead he had left, Whitaker himself. The judge was on the run, a fugitive after Tatum's confession and the USB's revelations, but Isaiah knew men like him didn't vanish clean. They left trails, crumbs of arrogance that could lead him back. He called Marla Evans from a burner, Phone Otis had slipped him, her voice weak but fierce through the hospital line, her shattered elbow still healing as she promised to rally her contacts in Montgomery. She'd heard whispers of Whitaker hiding out in a hunting cabin upstate, a rumor from a trucker who'd seen a pickup matching his parked off a dirt road near the Tennessee line. Isaiah scribbled the tip on a napkin, his hand steady despite the ache in his arm, and spent the next 2 days piecing together a plan, calling every ally he could reach. The federal investigator, a pro bono lawyer Marla knew, even old Mr. Jenkins from the trailer park, now couch-surfing with kin after the fire. By Saturday he had enough, a map, a hunch, and a drive to end this once and for all. The lawyer, a wiry black man named Darius Cole, drove him north in a beat-up sedan, the road winding through pine thickets and red clay hills, the air crisp with the promise of November. They found the cabin at dusk, a ramshackle hideout tucked in a hollow, Whitaker's pickup parked out front, its tailgate still caked with crestwood dust. Isaiah stayed in the car, his crutches a liability, while Darius crept closer, snapping photos through a cracked window. Whitaker, inside, hunched over a table, papers spread out like a war map. Darius slipped back, his breath fogging as he showed Isaiah the shots, and one caught his eye. A ledger, its pages yellowed but legible, a list of names and numbers that made Isaiah's heart stop. He zoomed in on the grainy image, his good eye squinting, and saw it clear as day. Payoffs to Tatum, dates matching every frame job, every beating, every lie Crestwood had piled on him, but one entry stood out, a name he hadn't expected, a ghost from a past he'd never known. Malcolm Carter, 2008, $5,000 disposal, it read, and Isaiah's breath caught, his hands shaking as he gripped the phone. Malcolm Carter was his father, a man Ruby had said died in a car wreck when Isaiah was 2, a story she told with tears and a far-off look he'd never questioned until now. He demanded Darius get the ledger, his voice raw, and the lawyer nodded, slipping back with a crowbar to pry the door while Isaiah waited, his mind spinning like a tornado. Whitaker fought when Darius broke in, a scuffle that ended with the judge. Sprawled on the floor, his nose bloody, the ledger snatched as Darius bolted back to the car. They peeled out, tires spitting gravel, and Isaiah clutched the book, flipping pages as headlights cut the dark, his good eye scanning every line, until the truth hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. Malcolm hadn't died in a crash. He'd been murdered, paid for by Whitaker, killed for digging into the same corruption Isaiah had uncovered, a whistleblower silenced with a bullet in a back alley, his body dumped in a ditch and called an accident. Ruby had lied to protect him, to shield a toddler from a truth too heavy to carry. But now it was out, a wound ripped open 16 years later. Isaiah collapsed against the seat, his crutches clattering to the floorboard, his breath hitching, as tears spilled down his bruised cheek, the ledger trembling in his hands. His fight wasn't just his, it was his father's, a legacy of resistance that had cost Malcolm his life, and now tied Isaiah to a deeper pain, a generational scar carved by Crestwood's hate. Darius drove straight to the feds in Birmingham. The ledger handed over as evidence, and by morning Whitaker was nabbed in a dramatic raid, his cabin swarmed by agents who dragged him out in cuffs, his face a mask of rage on every news channel from Mobile to Memphis. The story broke wide. The judge's corruption, the payoffs, Malcolm's murder, a scandal that shook Alabama to its core, and Ruby's arson charge crumbled under the weight of it, her release ordered within hours as the feds took over Crestwood's rotting justice system. Isaiah met her at the jail gates, hobbling on crutches as she ran to him, her arms wrapping him tight despite his bruises, her sobs muffled against his chest as they held each other up. 2 survivors in a war they'd barely won. The town was theirs to reclaim, but the cost was etched in every scar, every ash heap where their home once stood. A week later, Isaiah enrolled in law school, a scholarship from a Birmingham firm covering his tuition, his crutches traded for a limp as he walked the campus, a fire in his gut hotter than ever. He'd beaten Whitaker, freed Ruby, exposed Crestwood, but the ledger's truth had rewritten his story, tying his fight to a father he'd never known, a man whose blood ran in his veins and whose defiance fueled his own. As he sat in his first class a textbook open on the desk. Isaiah knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a war against a system that wouldn't stop until he made it, and he'd fight with every breath, for Ruby, for Malcolm, for every soul Crestwood had tried to bury. Isaiah Carter's journey through Crestwood's corrupt justice system teaches us the raw power of resilience against systemic racism. His story shows that intelligence and determination can topple even the most entrenched oppressors, like Judge Harold Whitaker, whose hate fueled a machine of injustice. Isaiah's victories, outsmarting a courtroom, exposing a conspiracy, surviving a hitman, prove that one voice can spark change, even when the odds are stacked sky high. Yet the cost was steep. His home burned, his mother framed, his father's murder revealed, a reminder that fighting bigotry often demands everything you've got. It's a lesson in sacrifice, showing how personal losses pile up when you challenge a system designed to crush you. Ruby's unwavering faith and Isaiah's refusal to bend highlight the strength found in family and self-belief, even as Crestwood's retaliation escalated from false charges to outright violence. The federal investigator's role underscores the need for outside accountability when local power rots, while Whitaker's downfall proves that truth, wielded boldly, can dismantle empires of lies. This tale urges us to question authority, to dig deeper when justice feels wrong, and to stand firm when the world pushes back. What will you take from Isaiah's fight? Comment below if his courage inspires you. Hit like if you're fired up by his win, and subscribe and share to spread this story of defiance. Thanks for joining this journey. May you find strength to face your own battles and justice to light your path.